Good morning, everyone. My name is Nick.
Hi, Nick.
And I'm here to talk to you about this. So, if you take nothing else away from my talk, I want you to take away the notion that your time is valuable. Life is filled with people who will not respect your time. And the internet empowers us to find people who will. But your time is valuable. And so is that of everyone else. So for folks that thought, of course my time is valuable when you saw that first slide, this slide's for you. When we're busy, when we're stressed, it's really, really easy for us to forget that other people are also busy and stressed. There's a saying that goes, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And this slide's for me too, because arrogance comes really, really easily to me, and it's a very short step from there to disrespecting other people's time. And so the generosity of spirit in the open source community is truly, truly phenomenal. But it's bad if that comes at the expense of people's health, their personal relationships, or their work commitments. And so we need to care about how our benefactors are sustaining themselves, and in many cases, the people who depend on them for support. And so we need sustainable open source development to be the norm, not the exception. A lament I hear a lot is nobody pays for open source software. And then I look at what I do for a living, and I revise what I heard. Nobody I care about pays for open source software. Now, other than games, I personally have a hard time bringing myself to pay for useful software that isn't included as part of a piece of hardware that I bought. Scientists and educators, the folks that I personally most care about helping, often have no budget to pay for software. And many of my open source peers appear to be in a similar situation, that the folks we most want to help and empower have more important things to be spending money on than on software. So that means if we care about the sustainability of open source development, we're going to have to get a little bit more creative. Something we can easily lose sight of as technologists is that technology ultimately doesn't matter. What matters is people and the way we can bring technology to bear to better address their needs and to allow more people the opportunity to achieve their goals and ambitions. But in a networked world, software is an essential facilitator and enabler in connecting people. And that software requires maintenance. So Tim O'Reilly has a wonderful saying on doing business in a networked world: create more value than you capture. Every time I hear that phrase, I always follow it up mentally with the idea, capture enough value to thrive. Not enough value to survive, enough to thrive. Educators, scientists, the public service, nonprofits are often poorly served by traditional software vendors. Open source means we can help these communities to help themselves. But we still need to eat, we still need somewhere to live, and we want to avoid being permanently beholden to whoever happens to be currently employing us. So we do the job, and then we get paid. But wanting to get paid is all well and good, but the marginal cost of software is effectively zero. A fundamental precept of business is to charge for scarce resources. So what do we do now that software is abundant? Anyone can go online, easily find a copy of any piece of software they really want to run. Now, if you go to the traditional software world, the answer to this is, well, let's waste a lot of time and a lot of money and ruin a lot of people's lives by coercively enforcing artificial scarcity. Yeah, let's not do that. Bundling with hardware works, but it poses really high barriers to entry. It's like you have to build a hardware company just to sell software. No, that doesn't make any sense. Let's not do that either. We will do that, but somebody else can do that. So we need a different answer, one that doesn't require the huge upfront investments involved in getting into the hardware industry. And so this is kind of a bit of business development 101 type stuff, that you want to look for something which has expansive future demand, but you also want to find something that has a naturally limited supply. And somewhere in that, you can find your business model. So software business models were originally built on the idea of paying for upgrades. And software upgrades used to involve printing and shipping physical media. You had to get floppy disks to people. You had to get CDs to people. You had to get DVDs to people. That cost a lot of money. And so the business model aligned with the cost of delivering the upgrades. And that was great, sort of. However, the internet changed all that. It's like, with the internet, delivering the software upgrades is pretty close to free. And it really, really broke the analogy powering the pay for upgrades model. And so what we basically need to do is we need to revise our hardware-software analogies and find a way of making money that makes sense to people. So when you're in the hardware business, hardware allows you to charge for both new devices and maintaining existing ones. The latter's kind of gone out of fashion of late, but once the hardware gets expensive enough, then buying a new $3 billion plane just because your previous one broke, well, you're not going to do that. So when you're in the hardware maintenance industry, it's both reactive, fixing stuff that's already broken, and preventative, that you basically keep it from breaking in first place. You grease the wheels, you treat it so that it doesn't rust, all this sort of stuff that you just do preventative maintenance to keep your hardware from breaking. So you don't only take your car to the shop when it's already broken, you also take it to the mechanic regularly to get it checked and say, please make sure my brakes don't fail. All that sort of stuff that we do for preventative maintenance on hardware. Now, the interesting thing is that software also decays over time. And this is completely counterintuitive. I mean, it's just bits. How can bits decay? It's like, we can perfectly replicate them. We can, okay. So yeah, so the software decays over time. So this is less intuitive, but it really happens. And the reason software decays over time isn't because the software changes, but because the environment it's operating in changes. So the hardware changes, the operating systems change, regulations change, development techniques change, social norms change, user expectations change. The world doesn't stand still, and we have to run just to keep up. And this is where things get interesting, because once we've deployed a piece of software to serve a particular purpose, we really want that software to keep serving that purpose. When your question is, will this work today? Then sure, unsupported open source will work fine. You can just go grab it from the internet, deploy it, problem solved. But what if your question is, will this still work tomorrow? Will it work next week? Will it work next year? Will it work next decade? Folks that have the luxury of asking these kinds of questions are generally willing to pay for good answers. And so here we see a potential opportunity, sustaining engineering for mission-critical systems. And welcome to the green part of the technology adoption curve. This is one of my favorite diagrams on Wikipedia. And the green section of this curve is the place where successful open source vendors go to make their money. Because this is an adoption pattern that recurs over and over in industry after industry for innovation after innovation. And way over on the far side there, you have the innovators. So innovators are experts who want to be on the cutting edge. They're looking for new ideas. They're trying out new approaches. And the interesting thing is that just because we decide it's interesting enough to try out doesn't mean we're going to stick with it. Because we may go, yeah, you know what, we tried that, didn't actually work so well. Throw it out, try the next new idea. Then just behind the innovators, we have the early adopters. These are the folks who are watching what the innovators are doing and going, oh, yeah, you know, that thing there that they're doing, that's really interesting. That's got a lot of potential. How can we take that, file the rough edges off, make it more easily consumed and applicable to a broader range of use cases? Expand it, because the innovators will generally solve their particular problem and then leave it to somebody else to generalize it. And so here in this diagram, we see a particularly important marketing concept called the chasm. And any new technology, the chasm is basically the idea that new technologies, it's really, really easy to attract the attention of folks who are always looking for and trying out new ideas. Everybody else are a lot harder to reach because it's like, we don't care, we just want something that works. And so this is where it becomes possible to make money making open source, which is that when you're dealing with the innovators and early adopters, then what you're doing is you're saying, like, look, let's just do it for free. Let's just work together to make it better and advance the state of the art. And then you make your money in the popularization area, where you say, you go find the people who say, I don't care about the technology, I just want something that works, and you go solve their problems. But an opportunity only becomes a business if you can figure out a revenue model. You want an essential capability that you deliver better than anyone else. And so this is software. It's like, you can freely replicate it. It's like, so where's the supply constraint? Well, thanks to open source, software is now cheap. Thanks to the public cloud, deploying a new application is now easy. But there's an interesting statistic. According to an IDC survey last year, there are less than 30 million information computing and technology professionals worldwide. There's apparently less than 20 million people who know how to program, and that's counting the hobbyists as well. We're not the 1%, we're the 0.05%. So the care and feeding of existing software remains expensive because you have to hire the people. And this brings us back to that point on the first slide. Your time is valuable. So we have a potential opportunity and a natural scarcity. So let's look at the approaches folks currently take to solving this sustaining engineering problem. Open source is often deployed without any sustaining engineering plan at all. I call this the magic internet pixies model. And it assumes pixies will handle the changes in technology and regulations that affect our business or our organization. Now, the interesting thing about the magic internet pixies model is new feature development is actually fun. There are lots of people who will develop new features and new pieces of software for free. It's like, if all you care about is new features, magic internet pixies works great. Sustaining engineering is boring as hell. It's like nobody wants to spend their Saturday night figuring out what the hell is going wrong when this obscure piece of hardware encounters this obscure piece of software and they get into a fight. It's a great job, a lousy, lousy hobby. And the thing about the Magic Internet Pixies model, the Linux Foundation's Core Infrastructure Initiative, formed in response to things like shell shock and Ghost, it shows that even organizations that should know better can still make this mistake and end up relying on the Magic Internet Pixies. Don't do that. Now, a significant step up from the Magic Internet Pixie model is when staff time gets allocated to engaging directly with open source communities. And that includes hiring existing contributors to a project for key dependencies for your business. Now, one of the interesting things is that people will often say, oh, yeah, we have that contributor working for us. So yeah, we're doing self-support. If they're not spending work time on upstream stuff, then no, you're not. You're still running Magic Internet Pixies. It's just that some of the pixies happen to work for you. And the thing is, if you're a big enough organization, this model can actually work really well. You have the scale, you can hire enough people to actually be able to do this properly. But for smaller organizations, this model kind of ends up being, it's a really good way to form single points of organizational failure because upstream contributors aren't somebody you can readily hire a replacement for because a lot of their influence comes from their personal relationships and who trusts them, what systems they have access to, and which communities they know how to work with and influence. Now, if your organization is small enough, you have so many single points of organizational failure that what's one more? But in that mid-range between the absolute giants and the really small startups, there's a large range of companies where self-support just doesn't make sense. And one of the other interesting aspects of this model is that really constrains the number of communities you can engage with effectively, because engaging effectively with an open source community can be a full-time job. So organizations, depending on open source, have a need for sustaining engineering. The lack of expertise and a lack of scale can limit various organizations' capacity for self-support. So that opportunity is basically where you see commercial open source redistributors show up. And one of the key services they're providing is community engagement as a service. It's what customers obtain is a single place to obtain software, report problems, and suggest improvements, but they benefit from hundreds or even thousands of different open source projects. And this model basically works regardless of whether you're delivering the software to customers as an online service or whether you're delivering it as a software subscription. The key is that the customers say, we want this software to be maintained and we want to know it's being maintained and we're willing to pay someone to make that happen. There's a really, really big moral hazard here though. Like, as a commercial open source redistributor, you're making money from the freely shared work of others. And so if you're not careful, you can easily cross the line into unfairly exploiting the community. Fortunately, there are some relatively straightforward steps a redistributor can take to help ensure they're engaging collaboratively with the upstream communities rather than merely exploiting them for free labor. First and foremost is the notion that reciprocity is essential. It is not optional. And the key here is that it means you are playing by the same rules that all of your other contributors are. And so a big red flag for deliberate community exploitation is when an organization is happy to accept and profit from the work of others, but refuses to grant them the same freedom for that organization's work. And so the simplest possible approach to dealing with this is to say the upstream community gets access to all of the software they helped write under the same copyright terms that the company is using to power their own business model. And one of the interesting things about this is that trademark law then still provides you with plenty of opportunities to differentiate your commercial offerings from your community projects. One of the other key aspects is that when you're doing software development in the presence of commercial deadlines, you're often going to make technical compromises in order to meet your shipping dates. So if anyone who's dealt with the open source community was going to be aware, most communities don't care in the slightest about your deadline, and they're going to reject your technical compromise and say, no, 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 do it right or don't do it at all. And so what this means is if you want to build a sustainable open source business, you have to design in the ability to diverge from upstream temporarily. And what that lets you do is it lets you solve problems on the commercial side in a hurry when you absolutely have to. And then take your time in bridging that gap between you and your community and say, look, we did this for these reasons. Can we come up with a better solution or a fixed solution, or just have the conversation as to why you think the change is necessary before you actually get that change back upstream. And one of the other interesting side benefits of this is that it's actually a really interesting way of quantifying your technical debt, because everything you're carrying on the commercial side that the community hasn't accepted is generally a pretty good sign that there's something dubious about it technically. Not always, but quite often. And so the stuff you haven't upstreamed yet becomes the, we're possibly doing something wrong here and we should probably do something about it. That case of your deadlines being your problem, I think, is a special case of this idea, that there's no obligation for anybody that you're not paying. And two of the essential things that I believe should always be paid for are availability and responsiveness. Open source in general has a real problem where we'll not only allow, but actively encourage folks to volunteer for these kinds of high time commitment roles. It's a fast path to burnout, and it's an area where downstream redistributors and folks running self-supported open source have a big role to play. And the reason is that because we actually have money to spend. And so either through direct funding or indirect funding through trade associations and charitable foundations, we can actually fund a bunch of these roles where availability and responsiveness are important, and actually make it so that people can do those as a career. And so this then kind of expands out again into the general concept of respecting people's time. If we're not paying for something, then folks are doing it because they find it rewarding. And vendors and commercial users' business needs really come down a long way down the priority list for most community contributors. And this is exactly as it should be. So if a vendor or end user wants something particular, they need to be prepared to commit to providing the time and energy needed to make it happen, and also to work collaboratively with the wider community to seek agreement on a particular course of action before proceeding with it. So we've established there's a demand for a consistent approach to sustaining engineering across a wide range of open source projects. We've established contributor time as a scarce resource we can charge for access to. And we've identified some key missteps that lead to crossing the line into exploiting upstream communities rather than collaborating with them. Well, that finally brings us to the title of this talk: Contributors, Colleagues, Clients, and Customers. 4 very different ways of directly or indirectly engaging with an open source community. Different folks care about different things, and so where they sort themselves into these categories is going to have a lot to do with what they want to achieve, whether they want to have a global impact or a local one in relation to a specific organization or problem. And it's also going to vary based on the kind of time they have available. So we'll move into exploring those in a bit more detail. So contributors, I basically think of as folks that want to change the world as a hobby. The key distinction I make between contributors and colleagues in open source is contributors are offered the opportunity to have an impact, but they have no specific responsibilities. So where projects have the authority to decide to accept or decline attempted contributions and to define the criteria for acceptance, whether or not the payoff in personal experience and impact on the project for meeting those criteria is worth their time, that's a question that each individual contributor or potential contributor has to answer for themselves. And quite often, people are going to go, you know what? That's not worth my time. That's not my thing. I don't want to do that. I'm going to go do something else. That's fine, because this is a hobby. If it's not fun, don't do it. But there's a lot of people for whom this is a great way to go. Students, academics, established industry professionals, retirees, and folks that simply enjoy tinkering with code or making that code easier to use, or just exploring stuff and sharing their experience on the internet. This is these can be great reasons for getting involved in open source as volunteer contributors. Not my circus, not my monkeys is a wonderful Polish saying for disclaiming responsibility for solving a problem. One of the most important things to remember with volunteers is that earlier slide about no obligation without compensation. It's not their circus. Everybody else, not their monkeys. So the only real obligation that individual contributors have is to respect community codes of conduct. When we don't want to do that, we have the entire rest of the internet to play in. But yeah, so if we want to join a community, it's play well with others. But beyond that, we choose our own level of participation. It may be, yeah, it's up to us as individuals. We're not accountable for anything except our own behavior and the way we treat our peers. But once folks start accumulating responsibilities in a community, the time commitments start to grow. Sustainability requires finding ways to get paid for the work. It's important to care about the sustainability of our peers' community involvement and support folks in managing their stress levels. And so colleagues in this sense I'm talking about here may not be employees of the same company or the same organization. They may work for trade associations, they may work for nonprofit foundations, they may work for competing commercial redistributors, they may work for companies that are running self-supported open source, they may work for consulting companies that rely on the project, they may work for the government, all sorts of possibilities, all sorts of organizations, all sorts of interesting contacts. But there's a problem here. So involvement in open source communities builds on the 3 pillars of interest, ability, and time. A lot of organizations are building hiring pipelines that rely on seeing open source contributions before they'll consider hiring someone. Now, it's very easy to see why organizations are tempted to do this. It lets you gauge somebody's level of interest and ability before you actually start the employment conversation. The reason it's really problematic is that third pillar I mentioned, time. It's like, even if interest and ability are randomly distributed across the population, history means that free time is systematically biased. It's like, there are structural biases that alter the amount of time that different people have according to demographics. So a couple of really important organizations in relation to this, like this is a really serious problem. And so two organizations I want to highlight in relation to this. Outreachy, which is now part of Software Conservancy. This is a group that offers paid scholarships to folks from underrepresented groups to give them opportunities to spend time working on open source projects. And another organization that's very, very important is the Model View Culture, which is a publication from Model View Media. And so what Model View Culture do is they're a media organization that does its job properly and actually holds up a critical mirror to our industry. Whereas if you look at most of the tech and business press, my description of it is that it's basically gossip magazines starring tech and business leaders rather than entertainment celebrities. It's like, information content's pretty low. But yeah, Model View Culture, well worth reading and well worth subscribing to. If they win, it says it will be a good thing for our industry. So that's the colleague side of the story, the contributor side of the story. But to actually make money, you need somebody who's going to pay you. One of the interesting things I see a lot with open source communities that are struggling to make money, or open source organizations, is the question they're saying is, I want to build this. How do I get somebody to pay me? If you actually want to build a sustainable business, that's the wrong question to ask. The question you need to be asking is, whose problems am I planning to solve? Why should they trust me? And how are they going to pay me? Now, the most obvious form of this in the client case, so the high-touch, high-engagement case, is when you're actually running an open-source-based software consulting business. It's like, people are hiring you to come solve their problems. You're using open source to do it. The open source is an implementation detail. A second form is folks actually working for organizations running self-supported open source software. The organization deploying the software pays them to work on it. And then the third form, which we're starting to see more particularly in the scientific Python community, is folks actually applying for and receiving philanthropic grants to actually develop public good community software. So the Project Jupyter and IPython Notebook, an awful lot of that work is now being funded through foundational grants in the US. And so that's basically giving the ability to hire people to work on it full time. But funding based on specific clients or particular benefactors, it can work well at smaller scale, but it struggles to find the kind of recurring revenue the kind of recurring funding stream that is needed to sustainably commit hundreds or thousands of people to working on open source community contributions. And so this is where the green section of the technology adoption curve comes in. Users looking for solutions that solve their problems at a price they're willing to pay. And so the key business development task here is figuring out what folks are ready, willing, and able to pay for that you're prepared to invest time and money in delivering. So that's all been very nice and hand-wavy. How well does it actually work? Well, so from my point of view, there's two key aspects to consider in answering this kind of thing. So on the client and customer-facing side, the main difference between open source software and other software development models is really you get an extra no lock-in selling point. Beyond that, you live and die the same way any other software business does, on the quality of your engineering, your product management, your customer support, your documentation, your training offerings, your partner ecosystem, your strategic gameplay, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of ways to fail here. very few of them have anything to do with whether your software is open source or not. And everything to do with the fact that building and running a sustainable business is just hard. It's like the number of ways to fail is phenomenal. It's like, I think the stat you see kicked around is something like 90% of small businesses fail. I think that's a general stat rather than software specific, but building a business is hard. On the community-facing side, it's a very, very rare company that will actively try to engage their community in the governance process. As a result, most companies that publish open source software gain only a tiny fraction of the potential benefits available by engaging in good faith with industry peers, academic researchers, hobbyists, students, and more. Unfortunately, the open source industry is still young enough. They were short on good scientific studies. So I don't have any wonderful, rigorous data analysis to share with you. What I do have to share is some personal experiences and personal examples of personal relevance. And so the plural of anecdote is not data, but you got to start somewhere. So I work for Red Hat. This is a slide from Jim Whitehurst's keynote at Red Hat Summit this year. Now, 4 years ago, I left Boeing Defense Australia to go work for Red Hat Asia Pacific on their internal tooling. Earlier this year, I moved over from there to work on the developer experience team for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, the fascinating thing about the way Red Hat works is in the center there, you have the sprawling open source community. At last count, over 1 million projects available online that anybody can just go and grab. The quality of those varies wildly, to say the least. And so there's then a whole pile of different integration projects that Red Hat is heavily involved in. And these community integration projects basically serve to filter that enormous cloud of millions of projects and say, hey, we think these ones are interesting, especially when you put them together like this. And then those community integration projects are really, really useful in their own right. That you can use them, you can download them directly and just use them yourself. But then we get into all of that earlier section of the thing, which is where we say, well, these are the versions we're working on and actively developing. And then here are the versions we're prepared to call done. And those become the commercial products that will actually ship out to customers and say, yep, we will commercially support these. We will help you with these if you need help with them. So Denise Dumas, the vice president, heading up RHEL Engineering, so my boss, effectively, with a few layers in between. So she presented just this week at Fedora's Flop conference on what our current areas of interest are in the operating system world. So way down in that far bottom right corner, where you see Fedora to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, that's basically what Denise was presenting on. And so if you look up the videos for Flock, you'll find Denise's presentation. Relevant to this audience, one of the things in that is, yes, we are working on getting Red Hat Enterprise Linux to Python 3. And so while this talk is my personal perspective as a frontline open source developer who works for a large open source redistributor, what I'm saying here is consistent not just with what Red Hat's leadership say, but also with what we see them do. It was really, really cool seeing Denise's talk last week. But this is a Python conference, not a Linux conference, but not a systems management conference. And so I've been a CPython core developer for around a decade. So what this slide shows is some of the major community and commercial redistributors of CPython. What's not shown on this slide is all the Python using organizations, all the Python consulting shops, all the folks using Python for in-house development and data analysis. If you want to see some of those names, I really, really suggest checking out the PyCon US sponsorship list. It's like a who's who of computing. Another good list to check out is the OpenStack Foundation's, the OpenStack trade associations, sponsor members. Again, who's who of computing. And so anyway, one of the huge benefits of this aspect for me is that sustainably creating and giving away open source software is a pretty amazing goal. And being able to be part of that process is an astonishingly rewarding experience. So, and another company and project that I think are currently doing this right are a group called Roundcube, and they produce a popular open source webmail interface. And so with Colab Systems, they crowdfunded investment in a major user experience update for Roundcube. And I think that campaign was really well designed because they had a $10,000 tier which let them give the opportunity to identify potential colleague organizations, while the lower tiers still gave potential contributors and customers plenty of opportunity to participate. So I'll be really interested to see how this evolves as public cloud hosting evolves to make webmail hosting a lot easier. I've got 5 minutes. So, but different folks have different reasons for wanting to be involved in open source development. And I can't honestly speak to anyone else's motives, but I can speak to my own reasons for wanting to work in that kind of environment and help more folks succeed in doing so profitably and sustainably. And for me, one of the big things is about return on time invested. Standard practice in our industry is to take people's work and lock it up behind corporate firewalls. I've been a value investor for even longer than I've been a C Python core developer, and I think this is a really bad deal. And so when I get to work on open source software instead, my potential reach is to anyone with an even intermittently working internet connection, and I'll always retain access to my work, even if I move between different employers. I think that's a much better deal, since it means current and future access to what I produce doesn't get tied up in the business interest and strategy of one particular organization. The other reason I like working on open source is that the advancement of human knowledge improved markedly when we advanced beyond alchemy and entered the era of chemistry and other open sciences. So the open source model, I think, holds a lot of potential to make the software development industry more broadly deserving of the title software engineering. If you want to see software engineering done right, look up the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratories C coding guidelines and compare it to the way most of us develop software. It's like, we do know what software engineering looks like, we just mostly don't do it because it's too expensive. And so open source in industry is essentially making the gap between traditional software development and actual software engineering narrower and cheaper. And that's a great thing for the industry and for the world. And the other thing is that sharing links with peers about saying, hey, project Y looks like it might be relevant to you, it can save us a lot of time as we stop reinventing things for no good reason. And when we do reinvent things, it will hopefully be for a good reason, and we can learn from past efforts in that area. The other thing is that this offers us increased negotiating leverage when it comes time to figure out work responsibilities, what we're going to do next. But getting back to that thing about the free time being inequitably distributed, what this means is that having access to open collaboration opportunities really matters. And getting bootstrapped into this process, unfortunately, has a lot of really high barriers to entry. And finding non-toxic communities to participate in can require a non-trivial amount of research. So I already highlighted Outreach and model view culture earlier. Two other groups I'd like to highlight are PyLadies and the Ada Initiative, who've done a hell of a lot of work around helping people to address unconscious biases and inadvertently exclusive behavior. And I would love to say that that was all that needed to happen. Unfortunately, not all exclusive behavior is inadvertent. Some of it's very, very deliberate and extremely directly hostile. And this is still all too common, especially online. So Randy Harper's Online Abuse Prevention Initiative is aimed at reducing the incidence of that behavior in general and working with various online platform providers to help make that happen. And then Zoe Quinn's Crash Override Network was set up to help folks deal with the consequences of being targeted by this kind of hostility. Like, these are two very important organizations. And again, these are organizations that We should all hope that someday they will be unnecessary, but right now they are very, very necessary and doing very important work. But getting back to that first slide again, the single most important point, your time is valuable. You want to look for clients and customers that respect your time and expertise, and will pay you accordingly. However, pointless secrecy wastes time and money for everyone involved. Default to closed is very, very rarely challenged, even in otherwise innovative organizations. However, from a personal point of view, organizations that demand we work in secret are limiting our potential reach, denying us future access to our own work, deliberately reducing our effectiveness as software developers, and deliberately restricting our future negotiating leverage with them and with other organizations. Now, given my own background in the military-industrial complex, suggesting that people only work on open source software would be the height of hypocrisy. It would also be genuinely bad advice. The current nature of our industry is such there are going to be lots and lots of times when agreeing to work on proprietary software is the right answer for us as individuals. However, when we do agree to work on secret software, we should do it with our eyes open. We should understand the potential benefits of defaulting to open that we're giving up. And we should aim to ensure that we're compensated accordingly. Thank you. So